Hi, my name is Andrew McMillan. I work as a tax partner. Don't know what run out for a firm called Johnston, Carmichael, from accountants and tax advisors. We've got 14 offices across the UK, around 900 staff. My day-to-day job, I'm head of innovation taxes. So that's a fancy way of saying I help clients with research and development tax claims for under the sandbox regime and for the creative sector taxes, which is what I'm here today. When I was speaking to Helen about speaking here, I first thought, well, I could talk about video game tax, I could talk about audio-visual tax consultations going on, and I could talk about hiring people abroad, like a previous speaker was talking. I told my chair there to stand up and start shouting about tax rules. I thought actually that would risk everyone falling asleep or running out, so I'd get someone who's much more interested in myself to come along and help. So I thought, Simon, I don't know if you want to do it.
Intro. Yes, okay, so I've been making games for around, well, certainly over 15 years. I had a strange transition between journalism, television, and film and games, which happened around 15 years ago. After being in those industries for about 10, and since then I've been working, making games generally with a narrative sort of spin on it. You know, my big passion in games is I see the potential of games as being this sort of incredible sort of narrative experience which can take the format of storytelling in different ways. And I still think it's on that journey. I don't think we've reached it sort of, you know, where that is. And recently, I mean, I ran a studio called The Secret Experiment for 8 years, which did various games, about ad infinitum. But more recently, about a year and a half ago, I set up a new studio called Stacking Chairs in Glasgow with 3 other players. And yes, we've got this sort of, I suppose, this shared vision to sort of bring sort of experiences like you find in Requiem for a Dream or Clockwork Orange, and these sort of like really sort of visceral sort of filmic or literary driven things, bringing that into games as sort of third person adventures, you know, allowing people the access to the world, access to the unique characters, you know, not necessarily creating branching narratives, but certainly making worlds which feel dynamic for you being in them. So that's the studio I'm in. That's been a year and a bit. We're signed at the moment, which is great, but can't tell you who until NDA. So we're currently in production on our first game, so it's very exciting.
You could probably talk about what the tax issue
no, certainly.
Try and avoid that today. So I'm just going to run through a bunch of questions, and I sort of came like lately. Simon and I had a little discussion, but these are things that people in my firm or investors were speaking to ask about a lot, and I think what I'll show is the naivety of a lot of people outside the games industry to actually what the strength of the modern games industry is. We're going to start quite often when I'm speaking to clients or investors, they recognise the success of the Scottish games industry specifically, that inevitably their point of reference is Grand Theft Auto or Rockstar. Whilst there's a lot of benefits associated with that type of kind of mega activity, do you think that hyper focus on Rockstar has overshadowed other great innovative work undertaken in the industry over recent years?
I'll start by saying I've just sent me 4 or 5 incredibly brilliant questions, but each one of them is a thesis in terms of the answer, so I'm going to try and speak quickly, because I think, and the GTA thing is really interesting to me. Saved by the Bell.
I was getting cold. I hope not, because I can not answer that question.
Oh yeah, my 17-year-old daughter calling back. Yeah, so does that answer your question? No, it's funny. I do like, I don't know. I'm sort of like, I suppose I'm one generation behind the sort of the DMA guys, and I think like, I mean, I do hear a lot the sort of people perceive it as a problem that like the Scottish games industry is often like, you know, when we make an appearance on a stage or when we're talked about, we're often pulling at these sort of like legacy roots, like, you know, obviously, you know, talk about Dave Jones and we'll talk about, you know, Carl McDonald, Brian Baglow. We see a lot of these familiar faces, and I think like, so there's a few angles to this question. So on one level, it's sort of like, you know, can we get visibility on the rest of it, please? But I would sort of say like, That's an interesting one though, because these guys are incredible advocates for Scotland. I mean, like, you know, they are getting up there and they are doing the talking and they are putting the front foot first. And I think you've got to think, like, although I'd love to think the whole community is doing that, it's not, you know. And I think, and it's so I think, like, on one hand, the GTA thing is like, it's a great legacy to have. I think when people talk about GTA, it is in two different ways. It's the GTA of the past, you know, the sort of, you know, the Dundee born and bred sort of defining the industry up here, and then there's also the modern sense of, you know, GTA and Rockstar being the sort of powerhouse in Edinburgh, and, you know, massive, you know, one of the biggest brands in the gaming industry, full stop. And I think it's interesting because from the Rockstar side, if you look at the Rockstar spin on the GTA, I think from the outside in, it's like, yeah, it's massive. You know, I'd be interested to know how many actual players really know if you ask them when it was made, if they were, and, you know, and even within the industry at large. But I also think it's really interesting that within the industry in Scotland, like, so, you know, I've certainly been living up here for 18 years, and, like, they're the most silent of all of the games developers, partly because they're so locked down in NDA. So it's quite interesting to say, like, it dominates the Scottish sort of mindset, but in some ways it sort of does and it doesn't, because actually when you're working as a developer in Scotland, Rockstar is actually one of the ones which is, there's a big black, thick curtain which you can't see behind often. You know, even people you know, you'll sort of have a pint with them and you can't for the life of you sort of squeeze out the latest sort of development nuggets from them. So I think it is an interesting one, and I think it's multi-layered. And obviously we have got other massive properties, you know, the Minecrafts and stuff like that, which all sort of have touch points in Scotland, like 4J and stuff. But I do definitely get the point that, you know, we've got incredible studios like the guys at Blazing Griffin, who's great, incredible murder mystery type games, and sort of really pioneering that track. We've got the guys like No Code, who, you know, obviously the sort of, you know, the atmospheric first-person horror stuff is, you know, is incredible what they're doing, and obviously they've just recently scored this sort of Silent Hill IP. So I mean, these are definitely things being worth shouting about. But it's interesting because I think, like, maybe the question is really at the bottom of this is, like, if Scotland doesn't want to be seen as in the shadow of GTA, well, what do we want to be seen as? You know, so, like, and I think that's, you know, ultimately, like, what is it we want to be seen as and why? What's the ultimate purpose of that? Because if we want to change that perception, that's something we have to do, not just complain about. And I think, like, you know, we have got some great stuff, but I think it probably needs a concerted effort from the Scottish games industry and maybe working with Scottish Development International, Scottish Enterprise to actually make that shift. Because I think, like, the best thing about Scotland is we're just so enthusiastic and powered, you know, like we're driven. But I think what we can't do is just see something and complain about it. Like, ultimately, if the GTA thing is an issue, well, let's work out why is it an issue, what do we want to be seen and known by, and then let's collectively make a difference, you know. And I think that's how I see it.
Yeah. Do you think Scottish Games Week, one of the purposes of us being to Brian about that is starting to try and sort of answer that question, is what do we want to be going forward, how do we bring together all of these different facets, education, government, industry, and actually create a positive sort of ecosystem in the future. Do you think events like that are the start of improving things, or do you think?
Yeah, it's true. No, it is. But then I suppose back to your first question, I saw a few criticisms being levelled on that. Like, the people who were pulling up on stage was you were buying into the legacy of Scotland rather than trying to buy into its future. And I think there's definitely something to be had about that. And I think there was an overall sense of optimism. There's always a tinge of any game development community have always been slightly browbeaten as well, because, like, we all know games are really hard to make, we all know games are really hard to fund, and ultimately most games aren't successful. So I mean, it's not exactly an easy industry to embrace. But I think, like, I thought the Scottish Games Week was, like, incredible in its ambition, and, like, you know, we should totally get behind it. You know, I think there was a few questions about whether there was a lot happening in those weeks, and it felt a little bit disjointed. So again, but I think ultimately that's sort of something which runs throughout Scotland. Like, you know, we're such a small, sort of brilliant community, yet, and things like this are great, but it shouldn't take things like this to make the community be constantly speaking. Like, if somebody asks me, like, what's happening in Scotland, it should roll off my tongue, not because I've read it in the press, but because I'm speaking to you guys. And I think that's, again, go back to the first question, maybe that's what we've got to try and act on here a bit more. You know?
It's interesting you say that a lot of games fail, because I speak to investors, I deal a lot with life sciences companies, and the proportion of life sciences companies that ultimately make it through, develop something good, go through clinical trials and actually make it, is a tiny, tiny fraction of the money available to those companies in terms of investment. Massive. So do you think there's, I suppose it comes back to the point where you need to shout about it more. Is, you can achieve X times your investment, and the likelihood of success is probably similar to that of investing in a life sciences company. Do you think it's just a lack of understanding from maybe the investors that are present in the British ecosystem?
Yeah, it's interesting. I suppose.
That's not on the question.
No. I don't know. I think investing in games is quite a risk-averse thing. Like more and more publishers, I hear, they ask you, what are your comparable games? And they don't want to hear a clever mix. They want to know, where can I look at that audience figure and check that? I can look at how much it's going to cost to make, how much it's going to cost to sell, what's your potential, what's your audience, and then what's the risk factor I put on. So and it's that risk factor. I think a lot of developers will be very familiar with this idea. If you've got a great creative idea, you'll pitch it to the publisher, they're super excited, you feel great, it's all going to happen, gets one step up the line, suddenly gets to the financial people going, no, it's not going to happen. And you're just like, what? We thought the idea was great. The idea is great, but ultimately they need some security in the fact that it's going to make them their money back. And it's interesting because I think other industries which are more used to risk profiling, and just using even the book industry. So the book industry will, the sums of money are teeny in comparison, but what they'll do is they'll commission 10 books, and they'll know only one of them is going to be successful. But actually, it's the fact that they're supporting this industry and the fact that they know the success will pay for the other ones. But certainly don't get that a lot from the way the publishing markets work. And also, from a pure investment point of view, most people will be investing off the back of the figures, not investing off the back of the idea, unless you happen to find somebody who's made their money from passion. You might get an Ian Livingstone or something out there. If you can pitch him a game which he loves, but even then, he's got a team of people who run the numbers. So I suppose if the question is life sciences people, I think life sciences though, I don't know. People don't need games. People want games. But life sciences, people sort of that's not going away, is it? People want to live longer. And so I think it's an interesting one. And I'm not quite sure how to answer the question, but yes, I think and also the best will in the world. The successes we hear about the games, we hyper focus on, but the majority of games are lucky if they break even as well. So it's not an industry which is a safe bet either. So there's a lot of things in that equation.
I wonder if this might change. We're seeing games that are games technology different in some other sectors. We're also seeing strong storytelling in original content video games now transition over to other forms of media. Do you think that trend will continue? Would that shift that balance in terms of desire to invest?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about Last of Us TV series on HBO and stuff is there's two ways you can look at that. You can either think games are matured to the point where their IPs are legitimate TV and film content, which is actually true in some cases. The other thing is the TV industry is on such a scrabble in itself to create content that they need IP, and they're like, shit, where can we get it from? And actually, to be fair, when you scrape, just think of how many streaming services and how many on-demand things, all of these are searching for audiences. And I think if you've got an industry which has an audience capture and that IP makes sense, well, sure. The Last of Us is great, and obviously the Hailing is a huge success, which I think it had 5 million viewers on its first opening night in America, which is great. And I think that's massive for them. And I think the opening night for the House of Dragon was 10 million or something. Everything you've got to be put into context though, because I know that EastEnders pulls in somewhere between 5 and 8 million a night when it's on. So if The Last of Us is as big as EastEnders in the UK alone, and I think figures you've got to be careful with, and I'm not saying that that's not it. I think what you are getting to is really interesting though, and this is about this idea that when audiences do accumulate around games, there is a value beyond the next game at times, and I think But I think that comes down to your company business rather than your product, because I think like as a business you have to work out whether you can go on that IP trail. Because if you do, you have to start thinking about it in advance. Like I do believe that it shouldn't surprise you if suddenly you get success and then there's other opportunities. Because actually, in my writing role, I've been brought in by various companies in the past saying, please can you back engineer our company into an IP that we can now make in a TV show, because we didn't think about it in the first instance. So I think there's definitely going to be opportunities. The other thing is really interesting is, so just going off piece of it, but Netflix, I was chatting to them about the way that they grow their subscription audience. Like when they're thinking about a new IP, they're not actually thinking about how do we feed or grow our entire audience as a healthy sense. They're not looking always for the next Squid Game, because that isn't how they grow the subscription. If they've already got like, X hundred million people subscribed, what they do is they nibble at sectors. So ultimately, if they were to bring in like the Witcher TV series, I mean, they're not thinking that that's going to grow their entire, that isn't feeding their current sort of TV thing. What it is doing is it's a niche possibly, which isn't currently on Netflix. So they know if they to commission the Witcher, that actually if that's going to bring in like, 5 million new subscriptions, like that is incredible for them. So that's a nibble at the market rather than feeding the beast. And I think like that's certainly how they work. And I think there's something really interesting about games in that, because when games build an audience and a sort of fan base, I mean, that is your currency, isn't it? I mean that's what generates your sequel, but it'll also be what sort of interests the other media concerns. The only one thing certainly from an indie developer point of view is you have to be, if you love your IP and you want to go on the transmedia route, you're probably going to have your IP sort of taken away from you in quite a vicious way, because if suddenly somebody's making a television or an animated series of something which you're making on hundreds of thousands of pounds, and they're moving into the multi-million stake, suddenly the tail starts to wag the dog. And I think like, although that can be fine if you've already proved yourself a success, like say if you look at something like Cuphead, so Cuphead's like my youngest daughter's favourite cartoon. She's never played the game, but it's an absolute favourite cartoon. And I think like if they started the cartoon at the same time as they started their game, the cartoon would have become the dominant IP holder. But what's good about them is they obviously built their IP, and then hopefully now they're doing a really good job of making a lot of money off the back of it. But I think if you do want to do the whole take your IP into other media, I think it does need to be built into your business strategy, not just, you can't just see it as a way just to, hey, make, just a random way of making more money or
Yeah. We've talked about their funding. One of the other problems I come up with against the clients a lot is they're acquiring and retaining talent. Is one of the biggest things they come up against day to day. Do you think that's a big issue? How do you think the government could do more to support in that sense? I know there's a consultation going on at the moment that they can potentially, we're talking about potentially restricting the amount of overseas spending you can put in your claim. Do you think that could have a detrimental?
Yeah, possibly. I think like the finding and retaining staff is really, really interesting, because I think it's like, because the games industry is built of people who want to make great games. I think if you start making great games, you might find that you find staff slightly easier to come to. Maybe that's oversimplification. But interestingly, I think if it all comes back around to this idea of innovation, I think if we define that Scotland wants to be the sort of innovative, risk-taking, really competent and sort of bullshit community of developers, I think that in itself would probably attract staff. I think people would come to Scotland. And I think when I used to work in television, there was always this thing that like people came. Scotland was really good because it was beautiful. It attracted older members of staff in television because they came with their families. It was cheaper to live, it was beautiful. So what we always found is if you were ever looking for really good directors or line managers or producers and stuff, actually there was loads of good staff, and it was quite hard on it was harder on that sort of like the people starting their journey because they always went to London because that's where the buzz was, And I wonder whether there's a little bit of that up here, like I think we're blessed because we've got Aberdeen, we've got the GSA doing its sort of interactive design courses, and we've got the University of Western Scotland. So there is actually a fair sort of amount of junior members of staff. But I think like if we get the we get the ingredients right, then we can start to sort of light on what Scotland is and why people would want to come here. And we've got this beautiful landscape and a nice economy. I actually think, I'm not going to say it's not going to be a problem, but I think I don't think it necessarily needs to be the problem that we assume it is. I don't think all game developers are created equal and we're just battling over wages and who pays the best. I think the product has an awful lot to do with the staff that we get.
That's great. I could ask you questions on things. I'll get some
No,
eyes from the back.
That's because of the answers.
Yeah.
It's not because of the time. This guy
Does anyone have any questions for Simon? Questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.